righty, I love it. What'll happen next? I don't know if this is going to invite Zoom people to come to church or keep them home. I don't know. We'll see. It's great. Dear God, thank you for the Spirit that lifts our hearts at this time in this world. Do it again. Amen. Let me begin by telling you a story of someone I dearly loved, a late friend named Leonard Zawoski. Leonard was a Polish partisan soldier in September of 1939. Think about that date, the first month of World War II. He was one of the first people captured in that war by the Nazis. Leonard was passed from makeshift prison camp to makeshift prison camp early in the war and ended up a prisoner at, wait for it, Wasatch. That was my last church. Auschwitz. Sounds a little like Wasatch. Auschwitz concentration camp. Not at all like Wasatch Presbyterian. Where he lived for 4 years. 4 years. He went from common prisoner with a life expectancy of 2 months to becoming a handyman at Auschwitz. They needed a handyman even at Auschwitz because the water pipes in the home of the camp commandant froze just like everybody else's. And Leonard's German was perfect, and that's what saved his life. What was most remarkable about him was that he was one of a handful of people ever to escape from that place of ultimate perdition. His first 2 escape plans had to be scuttled, and then over a period of a year, he patiently assembled 2 SS uniforms, complete with holsters made in the leather shop there. And then on a particularly sunny spring day, he walked out of the camp with 3 other prisoners in a carefully planned, low-key escape. Not long before his death, he told his story to a film crew sent to his home by Steven Spielberg. His story on the surface is full of intrigue and awesome risk-taking, but when he spoke to me of his time in the camp, he spoke quietly and soberly of the profound nature of bondage and freedom. What freedom is and what it isn't. He escaped the camp and eluded the desperate search the guards there made to find him, but he also spoke to me of a bondage that is harder to free oneself from. To be never able to free your mind of the images of what you saw when for 4 years you went to bed and rose again in the morning inside the closest thing this earth has ever known to hell itself. I will never forget the moment he rolled up his sleeve and showed me that tattoo that they'd given him there on his first day. Prisoner number 13390. Right there on his left forearm. It was like the images he could never shake, but it was also a reminder that when the deck was stacked against him, he won the battle of his life. There is freedom, and then there is freedom. So in the text we looked into here from the book of Acts, Paul and Silas are on their way one day to a house church they're helping to launch in the town of Philippi, when they're accosted by a slave girl. The youngster has a special talent. She is adept at telling people's fortunes, and as a result, those who own her hire her out to read people's palms and provide entertainment at corporate conventions. But here's the deal. The early Christians are convinced that she's possessed by a demon. She takes an unholy interest in 2 of them, Paul and Silas, and begins to follow the 2 of them all around town, shouting at them, saying things about them no one would know unless she was either their bosom friend or psychically gifted. Now, this woman is the picture of enslavement, right? And, enslavement can take 1,000 forms. If you've ever suffered, the torment of mental illness, or you or someone you love has fallen into schizophrenia or deep depression, you could tell us all something about what bondage is, right? I'm talking about dark, uncontrollable forces that some people often find difficult or downright impossible to hold back. Paul gets fed up with this woman's raving, and in the name of Christ, he cures her. Hooray, she's free. But wait, she's a slave. She is another man's property. Luke says that when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone because she could no longer tell fortunes, they seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace in front of the great people of the city. It reminds me of the story of how Jesus healed a deranged man once by casting some demons out of him and into, remember, a herd of pigs who promptly drowned themselves in a nearby lake. And for this act of charity, Jesus was immediately escorted out of town by the local pork dealers association, right, and told never to come back. Later in the book of Acts, Paul will convert hundreds at a Greek city called Ephesus, where the makers of silver shrines for the worship of the goddess Artemis will immediately be up in arms because Paul is ruining their trade. So Christianity in the early days was always bad for business, and the followers of Jesus paid dearly for that. So back to the story. Here is a woman who's been chained most of her life to the hell of demon possession, and then through the power of the Apostle Paul, she's freed from it. There ought to be rejoicing. But her owners are not free enough themselves to do that, right? They are not interested in having her good fortune compromise their high standard of living. They say, hey, a little religion is okay to a point as long as it doesn't affect my bottom line. Besides, they target Paul and Silas for special scorn because they're foreigners, right? And heaven knows you can't trust foreigners. Besides that, they're Jews, and we all know about Jews. And if that bigotry isn't bad enough, they go a little further and say of these Christians, hey, they advocate strange and unlawful customs. So look, the owners of the slave girl have used nationalism and bigotry and anti-Semitism and tradition, got to stand up for tradition to explain why their comfortable living ought not to be compromised. Well, we all know, of course, don't we, that nationalism and racism and anti-Semitism and holding to tradition can just whip up a lot of crowds in this country today, right? It has not changed a bit. So what does this rabble do? Well, they beat the holy heck out of Paul and Silas, and they throw them into prison and insist that the jailer keep them there tucked away until they decide on what they're going to do with them. So Paul and Silas are put in the stocks, feet and arms. They are chained and bleeding, and what do? If you watched the children's time, you saw that they decided to hold an old-fashioned sawdust revival meeting. Text says that about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. What's going on here? They've hit bottom, they've been beat up, but they seem to be having the time of their lives. 20-some years ago, I remember being bowled over by a story that was quite contemporary, but also so similar to this ancient one. I'd heard about a visit a Methodist bishop from Africa had made to a church in Evanston, Illinois. The bishop was Bishop Emilio de Carvalho of Angola. The church had a potluck to welcome their special guest, the way we used to have before the pandemic. And then they went into the sanctuary to chat up this bishop. What is it like to be the church in a Marxist country? They wanted to know. Well, this was the 1980s. One man asked, is the Marxist government supportive of the church? No, said the bishop. But we don't ask it to be supportive. Not long ago, the government decreed that we disband all women's organizations in the church. But the women are stubborn and they keep meeting. The government is not strong enough to do much about that. Another church member piped out, what will you do if the government becomes stronger? We shall keep meeting, said the bishop. The government does what it needs to do. The church does what it needs to do. If we go to jail for being the church, we'll just go to jail. That's when the conversation began to get really interesting. The bishop continued, "Jail is a wonderful place for Christian evangelism. Our church made some of its most dramatic gains during the Revolution when so many of us were in jail." "Why?" someone said. "Well," he said, "in jail you have everyone there in place. You have time to preach and teach. 20 of our pastors were killed during the Revolution, but we came out of jail a much stronger church." At that remark, the room went silent. The bishop read the mute reaction and then said, "Don't worry about the church in Angola," he said. "God is doing fine by us. Frankly," he said, "I would find it much more difficult to be a pastor in Evanston, Illinois. Here," he said, "there is so much, so many things. It must be hard to be the church here." Yeah. Back to the story. The earth heaves, prison shakes, doors open, everybody puts on one of these hats. The jailer wakes up quickly, sizes up the situation, and decides on suicide as the only honorable thing for a warder to do whose prison has been destroyed by a magnitude 7 earthquake. Apparently, having the key to someone else's prison cell doesn't make you a free man, right? Paul shouts, "Don't do it. No one's going anywhere. We're staying put. We're going to finish our revival meeting." The jailer is incredulous. "But look, you're free to escape," he says. Paul says, "No, you've got it wrong. We prisoners are free to stay. And you, our jailer, are chained to this prison, obviously. But you can be free too." I wonder if Paul was familiar with the promise Jesus once made to those closest to him when he said, "One day you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." So the jailer asks, "What must I do to be saved?" That is, what must I do to be really free? And that afternoon, he's baptized along with his entire family. So what is freedom? By the end of the story, everyone who at first appeared to be free, that's the girl's owners, the crowd, the jailer, they're all slaves. And everyone who first appeared to be a slave, that is the demon-possessed girl and Paul and Silas, they're totally free. Doesn't that beat everything? Because apparently there is freedom, and then there is the real capital F freedom. I had a parishioner once who was married 5 times. Every time she left a marriage, she said she did it because she felt stifled. She said she wanted to have her freedom back. And by the end of marriage number 5, she told me that she had finally begun to see a trend developing in her life. And she decided it was time for her to think seriously about what freedom really meant for her. I don't want to be glib about that. I'm divorced myself. St. Augustine wrote about this in the 4th century when he spoke of what he called libertas minor and libertas major. Libertas minor is the freedom to choose, and libertas major is the freedom to choose aptly. Aptly. The freedom to be who you were created to be, and to make choices in sync with that. That is the freedom Paul and Silas know about and treasure. It's the kind of freedom that gives them reason to sing and celebrate in prison at the top of their very lungs. Now, allow me to speak about another inmate of Auschwitz as we look at freedom even a little deeper here. Her name was Hillison, and I'm sure a number of you have heard of her and read her writings. She wasn't as fortunate as my friend Leonard Zawoski. Eddie's journey was detailed in a book called An Interrupted Life, which is made up of letters and diary entries she wrote during the early years of the Second World War before being deported by the Nazis to that terrible camp in Poland. Now, Eddie knew very well the fate that awaited her at the hands of her Nazi captors, and yet her letters are full of the most life-affirming reflections and statements of faith in life as it is that you will ever hear anywhere, which is just stunning. Here's just a snippet of what she wrote during her time waiting for deportation. She said, "I often see visions of poisonous green smoke. I am with the hungry, with the ill-treated and the dying every day. But I am also with the jasmine and with the piece of sky beyond my window. There is room for everything in a single life, for belief in God and also a miserable end." The ability to see and treasure the beauty of life gave her the power she needed to live every moment and take from every moment what she needed to ground herself in all that is good in the world as God made it. From that she found peace, real, unshakable peace. You know, at the end of his life, the Apostle Paul will be in another prison. And the Christians at the time, at that little fledgling church in Philippi, where the jail was rattled and fell, will look all over the Mediterranean world for Paul. Where is he, they'll wonder. Having found him finally in a little town of Ephesus, they will send one of their young men, Epaphroditus, to Paul to see to his needs in that prison. And we know this because of a letter Paul sent to them. The last one we know that he wrote before his death. And here's what he says. It could have come from Eddie Hillison. He said, "I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you've revived your concern for me." Well, indeed, you were concerned for me, but you didn't have an opportunity to show it. Not that I'm referring to being in need, even though he's in prison. For I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. But in any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and also of going hungry, of having plenty and being in need. I can do all things through the one who truly strengthens me. So Paul found what all people who find freedom know, that you live beyond circumstance. You live beyond blessing and beyond curse. God had given him the power to be himself, no matter what was going on. That is freedom, with a capital F. So, finally, the late Brian Doyle, editor of Portland Magazine and a fine essayist and novelist, understood this in his bones. So let me repeat once again the theme reading for today, his credo. You do your absolute best to find and hone and wield your divine gifts against the dark. You do your best to reach out tenderly to touch and elevate as many people as you can reach. You bring your naked love and defiant courage and salty grace to bear as much as you can, with all the attentiveness and humor you can muster. This is, after all, a miracle in which we live. Think of the smell of jasmine and that little patch of blue sky we in Portland prize above all. Brian says, we ought to pay ferocious attention at every moment. So what I understand this business of Sunday worship to be is a place where we attend to everything Brian Doyle says here. We have worship to an awesome God, and out of a garbage bag, we take 100 hats and throw them amongst ourselves. That's what salty grace is. That's the humor we muster in the face of anything. Right? This is a place where we suspend our doubts and disbelief, that all the news puts on us with its oppressiveness. We suspend our doubts and disbelief for an hour a week and let ourselves imagine that this is a miracle in which we live that invites us to pay that amount of attention every minute. So if that resonates with you, I invite you to support it with a decision to make being here each week on Zoom or in person a priority. And also, of course, support it with a pledge that reflects your decision to live intentionally and to value the source of meaning and purpose that you live out of, like the one we try to offer here 7 days a week, not just on Sunday. Because you are an integral part of what happens amongst us. Amen. Arise, your light has come.